Hello.
Excellent. Hey, can everybody see and hear both of us? Let's both talk a little bit.
Yes.
Okay, good. Awesome.
Okay.
Well, everyone, welcome to our 5th Patreon exclusive crowdcast. This is our 3rd with a guest. And our guest this time is Professor Ármann Jakobsson from the University of Iceland. He is I think, one of the foremost living scholars in Old Norse literature today, with a fascinating stream of research on the supernatural and the sort of more spooky beings in Old Norse literature, which I want to make the theme of today's discussion because it's the day before Halloween as we're recording this. So, Ármann, would you like to talk a little bit, give us a little bit of an intro to some of your work on this subject?
Yes. Well, originally, this was not my subject at all. My first book concerned kingship ideology in the Middle Ages, in Iceland in particular, in the King Sagas. And I wasn't really very interested with supernatural things when I was a kid. So I came late to it. And then in the 15 years ago or so, I had written a book about Tolkien and his influence from Old Norse and wanted to study elves and dwarves and all these figures more. And then I came up against the issue of taxonomy and categorization. Right. And ever since then, I've been, in a way, my focus went from the elves and dwarfs and all the supernatural beings to the people who see supernatural beings and talk about supernatural beings and want to be involved with them or experience them in some way. So in a way, the focus completely changed. And this is something that my book, The Troll Inside You, is very much about. It's trying to enter the mind of medieval people as well as one can, one is inside one's own mind, of course, but trying to imagine how a medieval person felt towards the what we call the supernatural or the paranormal. It's a phrase I use much, precisely because it's not much used about the Middle Ages. That was, in fact, my main reason for using it was that it's exotic for the Middle Ages. Like when you say paranormal activity, everyone thinks of the X-Files, right, and aliens and space. And I think it's good because in a way it helps modern people to take it seriously, because people don't take medieval threats very seriously, but they do take modern threats seriously. So I have used it precisely to bring it to make the medieval supernatural or paranormal or occult or whatever more real to the audience. And also I
was just going to say, would you say that the trolls and elves and dwarves of the medieval experience are equivalent to the way that people today might experience something like alien abduction phenomena or Bigfoot or the Hood folk or something like that?
There are certainly parallels. Of course, there is a difference in terminology. Like I began to study these terms and then I couldn't stop. And I found out that both troll and elf are probably not like the same kind of categorical terms that they are today. So when we have projected like 19th century definitions of these concepts onto the Middle Ages, I don't think there's any indication that either a troll or elf meant a single race of paranormal beings. It's a much more broad term. And of course, Tolkien will have impacted people. He, of course, was a early 20th century scholar, and he made them all into races, but they are not really. It's a much more broad term, and especially troll is easier to study than elf because elf doesn't appear all that much, and when it appears, it's only a word, and there's no depiction of the who it is you're talking about. Right. So So it's but I think it's more or less the same thing, that elf is a benign figure that people can worship, but is not necessarily one of the gods, like beings existing outside the pantheon. If we believe in a pantheon, of course, the pantheon of Old Norse gods is something that Snorri Sturluson presents to us, and he has probably knows all about the Greek and Latin pantheon, and who knows if it's accurate. But at least I think the elves are outside it, at least in some of the sources, but they're still venerated, whereas the troll is negative, I think, mostly negative, and something you accuse somebody else of being. And I think the witch is a primary example of a troll, and also the zombie or the ghost or the vampire, or whatever you want to call Old Norse ghosts, because you can call them all these things. Mm-hmm. One notices with modern scholars the tendency to use draugur as if it's a technical term, but it never was, and draugur isn't used. Glaumur is never called a draugur, for example. So after Ganga is much more prominent. So I would hesitate taking these Old Norse terms and acting as if they're clearly defined concepts.
Article, I think it was in 2007 in JEGP, categorizing the medieval Icelandic undead, really influenced the way I thought about this myself. I mean, you made some of these points there. How would you define troll? I'm kind of monopolizing the questions here for a minute, but could you give us a definition of Old Icelandic troll?
No, I think it's very hard to define, and I think it is meant to be. I think it's more scary if you don't really know what it is, but if you can use it about a number of things. But the trolslegur is used both about a witch and a ghost.
Could I use boogeyman as a rough equivalent, where different people might have an idea about what the boogeyman looks like, but we don't have a clear category about the boogeyman? We don't think of boogeyman as a species. It's just something scary.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how scary the boogeyman is in English, but you know, if he's scary enough, then you can use the word. And I use zombie. Zombie is another word I used deliberately. Of course, I know it's a word that comes from a completely different tradition, and I sometimes get corrected when I use it, but I'm using it precisely because it's not Icelandic. So I want to like.
I always use zombie for aftergången.
Yeah, and they behave similarly. Like there's this fairly rough. They walk slowly and they're very dangerous and they attack. So it's not. And vampire is actually used in 1897 about Glaumur. And this is actually, this was a clue to my new way of thinking. Like Andrew Lang, who's a very popular promoter of Old Norse things in the late 19th century and had a huge impact on Tolkien and others. He calls Glaumur the vampire.
Wow.
And of course, it was in 1897. And then 1897 is a very important year in vampire studies because that's when Dracula appears. So it's not a coincidence. And actually, in the Icelandic tradition of Dracula, which is very early, and it's a very liberal translation, the translator changes, he calls Dracula a draugur. So he takes the Icelandic word draugur for vampires. So there's a tradition for that, even though it was later eclipsed by the term that we imagine are technical. But in a way, I think the humanities, this is a much broader debate. I think the humanities should really resist trying to be science, act as if it is a slightly inferior form of science. We are a special field with a different tradition, and we have answered long ago some of the questions that science seeks to answer. They just don't know it. But so we have also a tradition that needs to be respected. And in a way, I think both science and the humanities work best if they don't pretend to be anything than what they are. So, but of course, it's good to read each other and be influenced. So I'm not saying that. It's just that.
No, that's a great point. I mean, I think I think that's part of this temptation to categorize and make stats. Like people want to know the stats of an elf, the stats of a dwarf, the stats of a troll.
Yeah.
These terms seem really just like the human mind, not as easily
It has much to do with the predominance of science in the 20th and 21st century. It's not a religion completely, because it has its own, but it has become, some people use it almost as if it is a religion that provides all the answer. And of course, to answer Rachel's questions from before, there is the sense of people in the humanities acting as if they're scientists to make themselves more valid. But the humanities, and especially literature, has a different kind of accuracy, like accuracy in the use of language. So in the way the humanities have their own very, not scientific, but scholarly method that's very rigorous, that we want to use words properly and know what we mean. And we think about what they mean before we use them. We just don't throw them out there. And this is an important tradition that needs to be, respected and upheld.
Right. Well, and I find on university campuses it can actually be fairly difficult to get respect from faculty in certain departments, especially from students, if you stray away from trying to present things in a more scientific way. If you are presenting the messy, if you're being faithful to, but presenting faithfully the messy way the human brain works, and the human brain works pretty messily about paranormal stuff.
Yeah. And it's complicated because also, like, people used to use analogies much more, and so it's in a way harder to be truly scholarly in the humanities, but we can still achieve it, I think. So many people, like beginners, have a problem with interpretation, like what really is interpretation, and is it a correct interpretation? You keep being asked that, can I interpret this as something, and then the people just make up their own things. And it's hard, you need to evaluate. Does this interpretation have any value? Like, is it in the text? I got a question here on the side about the corporeal, about ghosts being corporeal. And this is true about the Icelandic ghost. And you may remember Jean-Claude Smith's book about ghosts. And he's talking about the Western European tradition. And the ghosts are usually mostly not so corporeal. They are images that appear, but don't have this like Eastern European fleshiness to them. But the Icelandic ghost is very, it is a creature of flesh. So it attacks you literally. Mm-hmm. Or that is what it seems to be, because sometimes it's hard to know if it's a metaphor. And I've written one article about this in Saga, like, are they shapeshifters or are they not? Like, is it a metaphor? Is shapeshifting a metaphor, or are people really turning into animals? And when you ask this, you also have to ask, what is turning into an animal? How do you turn into an animal? Because it exists in literature, so it's a complicated issue. And Saga very cleverly never really. I think it's catering to two kinds of audiences, and this is something I think that the sagas do, that they do have a kind of double address. Some people may believe Kveldulfur literally turns into a wolf. Some people may believe it's just a metaphor. And I think the authorial figure, hard to speak of authors these days, but the implied author, the brain in the text, wants both types of audiences. So
that makes good sense. I mean, they're more sophisticated stories than people often give them credit for.
Yeah, I think so, very definitely. And this is something people have shown with folktales, that folktales seem very simple, but they're full of layers and analogies, and they're also like meant to reach people emotionally. So they have every kind. They're really quite complicated narratives, and the same goes for the sagas. There's a lot of thought in them, And very often literature scholars get asked, aren't you over-interpret? Aren't you over-interpreting? These medieval people, they were much more simple. But I don't think they were more simple. I think they were just as complex as we are, and possibly more complex, because they had less distractions. And, people without distraction, they tend to think more complicated things sometimes.
True. Is that how you get so many articles published?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to interpret in the sagas. So there's a lot of, in a way, the sky is the limit. I always feel we've just begun. The debate has just begun. And there are so many sagas that hardly anything of interest has been written about.
Saga, Great Saga.
Yeah. And of course, it's like these 100 years that were spent on origins of sagas. And I don't feel they were wasted. A lot of valuable things appeared, and there was a lot of valuable study, but it was all focused on the origins and nothing else. Everything behind the text, but not the text itself. So this was a bit what literature was. It was supposed to illuminate everything but the text, because everyone could read it and understand it. But what we have learned now is there's no simple act of reading, and no readers understand things in the same way. So it isn't just a matter of reading the text and then being told everything what's outside the text, as scholars sometimes seem to think. We need to also study the text more closely. And one thing I've discovered, not in a paranormal note, but related to it, is that people misunderstand sagas, like the very famous figure of Gudrun Ósvífursdóttir in Laxdæla Saga. People often talk about her as if she's a good-looking person, a glamorous person, but she's a very fierce intellect. And the saga keeps telling us that. It tells us that 4 or 5 times, how brainy she is. And modern readers sometimes don't register it. And I wonder, is the idea of a brainy woman so alien to modern readership that they just don't notice what it says in the sagas? So it's and this is it's very clear from the sagas. It's not just something I read into it.
Right.
There are clear authorial statements about this, that she is first and foremost a clever person. And this is not, she's not given credit for it always today. And of course, she's well known for her dreams, and they are also an intellectual exercise. And this is great.
Often considered part of wisdom. Right?
Yeah.
Njál has all kinds of dreams, and that seems to be part of how wise he is. I think when she's first introduced, she's called Vidtuk or Vis or something.
Yeah. And there's this sage who is in his 50s, and he's sitting and talking to this teenage girl, and is interested in her dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not normal. It means he's a prodigy, and he's recognized as a prodigy. And then we have this excellent duel where she relates her dreams, and they're kind of obvious what they mean. It's not hard to solve the puzzle. So one almost suspects it's a trap, that she has laid a trap for him. And this is something we also see sometimes with the paranormal. This is just about interpretation in general.
That's an interesting point. I'm going to have to reread the scene if we're talking to Gestur and think of it as possibly her laying a trap. That's a cool point.
It's a very humorous description, because he keeps interjecting things when she's telling him about the dreams. So and this is something the sagas do really well. This play between, they were very interested in people.
Right.
People are always asking me, what do the sagas say about the Northern Lights? Because people who come to Iceland, they're very interested in the Northern Lights.
I can't find the Northern Lights in the sagas.
No, there are no Northern Lights. They're mentioned in Konung Skugsja, but they're never mentioned in the saga. So they're not interested in them, and they're not interested in volcanoes so much. They're interested in people, in the petty squabbles of people. That's their main interest. They don't really talk about nature, but there's a lot of nature.
This actually came up in the crowdcast we did with Matthias Nordvig.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yeah, they're really talking about people, not about the landscape. They don't have these long, lush descriptions of the beautiful Icelandic landscape like people sometimes expect them to.
Yeah, the landscape has an impact, but it's not verbalized, so
Yes.
or not much.
Let's look at some more questions here.
Yep.
Did you address Phoenix? Up here.
I'm not sure.
Phoenix
I think
says.
so. Yeah. Well, yeah. The ghost in Iceland is corporeal. So and the ghost is a troll. It's just as often referred to as a tröll and as a draugur. So in a way, the ghost is not like a troll. It is a troll.
Right.
And about the bluishness of corpses, this is something written about long ago by Barber about Eastern European vampires. And there's every possibility that, decomposition has an impact on how these corpses are described. So I think that's well possible. And of course, it doesn't explain everything.
Right.
Yeah, they're not asking the easy questions.
Yeah.
DC, nobody knows what DC are. It's a strange word, and it clearly seemed to be related to the Latin word for God, Deus, but it's vague what they're like, and you may be thinking of the Dísir in Þiðranda Þáttur who kill him. They seem very corporeal. They're also called fylgjur, and in a way, Dísir is something I haven't really written about, but I've had to study it sort of peripherally, and I think it's another of those words that we don't really know what it means, and I think it would be hazardous to assign the characteristics of a race to the Dísir. It's very possible that it means a multitude of beings, like elf and troll, although I haven't looked into it in the same way, but I think it's most likely. But I'm not saying that there are no races or no racial theories. In the Middle Ages, we do see them, and we even see them in the sagas, like Bárðar Saga seems to be influenced by them. I'm just saying it's not the dominant mode to think about these beings.
Sure. No, I think you're absolutely right. Could I ask a follow-up question to that? Do you have an opinion on the etymology of tröll?
Yeah, no, I don't really. I have read what Wilbur wrote ages ago. The thing about etymology is it doesn't really explain anything. Like you come close to the original meaning, but I don't think the original meaning is clear to medieval people. So in a way, it illuminates something in the distant past, but it doesn't really illuminate the period I'm talking about, because they would have been just as unaware of the original meaning as people are today. So it doesn't really, it's not a good way to explain things.
Sure.
So
let me pose you a question that was asked by someone who's not able to be here.
Yep.
Marissa Lovett asks, I'm really confused whether or not pre-Christian Norse people believed in each person having multiple souls, as some animistic cultures believe, or if only witches have a wandering soul as well.
Yeah, this is not an easy question. There's not a lot of evidence about it. There's a lot of writing about it, and sort of the shamanistic culture. Tully has an excellent book, and of course Strömbeck in his day. We have this very elegant description of Odin from Snorri, where he's lying, but his soul is traveling. And there's also the possibility of the fylgja being a soul.
Sure.
And like being in two places at one seems to be a kind of thing a witch might be able to do. And Odin, of course, is, the archetypical witch in a way. Right. But there are not many instances of it. We don't really see many examples of that being happened. But I think it must have been one of the things people imagined a witch can do. Like people are still imagining it. You remember Hermione's spell in Harry Potter where he could study more by being at two places at once.
Oh.
This is a kind of who hasn't dreamt of this quality, like
Right.
when one meeting is ending and the other is beginning and there's no time to grab coffee, being in two places at once must be a wonderful thing. So this is something which, like, anyone with trollish powers would be able to do. So I think it would be at the very top of the wish list. And I think somebody mentioned the Eyrbyggja Saga, famous rivalry of witches part where the two witches are competing for this one bright, brilliant student, and so there the evil one seems to be able to be in two places at once, like he's attacking him, but possibly not. But this is one thing about the occult. It's not explained. It's like magic tricks. You cannot explain them. And if it was all explained, it would lose so much of its potency. So I think it's not random or meaningless that their description of what witches do are usually very vague. Like they stand and they recite, they chant, but what are they chanting? How does it work? What is the causal relationship between their chanting and what happens? Never explained, because it's witchcraft. Witchcraft should not be explained.
Well, I think we have this 20th to 21st century idea that there is a list of magic powers that you have. This is very D&D, right? Like, I have this spell that is this duration and this range, right? And then it kind of leaks into our perceptions. You look at Ármann, and he lists out 18 spells, and I've been asked, well, it looks like Odin has powers beyond those. Yes, I don't think it's a comprehensive list. He's bragging about some stuff he can do, right? It would defeat the purpose if he lists out every single one of his powers very specifically.
Yeah. Also, like with Odin, there's all these layers. Like, he's originally a cult figure, and then he's a witch. Did the people who believed in him also regard him as a witch? How we have so little access to their actual faiths. We know that Odin was worshipped. We don't know how or why or what he was supposed to be able to do. We just have this detailed but still very contradictory descriptions of his powers long after the religion has begun to fade. Yeah. So in a way, it's very hard to know.
I agree. Let me look at...
There are more questions. Yeah. I haven't answered all of them. Yeah, the Afturgangur. Yes. There's a question about Eyrbyggja Saga, and this is something I've also written about, and it's the relationship between how a person is in life and how they are in death. So Þórólfur Bæjarfótur is a very nasty man when he's living, and then he becomes a particularly nasty ghost after he dies. And there's no ambiguity as to that the fact that he was a nasty man affects his afterlife. And this is also true of other descriptions of ghosts, that they're often unpopular people who pose problems. And in this article, I was talking about the attitude towards old people in general, like if old people were regarded as a nuisance. And I'm sure there are some people today who regard old people as a nuisance, or some old person, perhaps just your president, but or any old people. But they do. Old people aggravate the younger generation, and you see a lot of that in the Middle Ages, and of course much less politeness in expressing it. So and in the sagas we have everyone wants to hear the other story, that old people had more respect and they had more value, but the medieval, the Western European and the Icelandic sources don't seem to confirm that. They give us many instances of hostility towards old people. So this may not have been what she was asking about. If the story makes use of symbolism, Could be an allegorical purpose. Icelandic sagas are not like purely allegorical. They do have general applicability. So I think they are meant to be general. I think all stories are meant to be general. I don't think really you tell a story. You may tell a story that's just about yourself and what you've experienced, but these are very dull stories. If they have no relevance to the audience or a general nature, they will not live. So I think all stories have this thing, but they're not like, they don't have like overt allegorical purpose, like everything is supposed to represent something else.
I think that's a big difference between good scholarly interpretation and the kind of like high school book report searching for allegories stuff that you sometimes see, especially like on the internet. I think it's well put.
It's also there's also confusion about the sign. People think that the sign is A means B, but the sign always means itself too. It never loses its own value. So I think there's some confusion about that with beginners.
Sure.
I'm asked about fylgja, spirit animal. Yeah, it's not a. Well, again, we don't really know what a fylgja is, but it's possible not completely dissimilar to a spirit animal. So I think a spirit animal would be a possible interpretation of the fylgja. And this recent work being done about fylgjur, that's very good, and it seems to point towards them mostly being like bestial. So it's like a fylgja is a beast, but again, the word usage is not as clear cut as one would like. Again, medieval words are not concepts. There isn't this scientific thinking, or it's not very prominent. So I don't really think I can ask the question. And hamingja is even more confusing. And this is one problem with what I do, is that it's so hard to provide easy answers. You come up against a lot of ambiguity, both because the instances are not many, but also because they're often vague, and we are dealing with a large period, and possibly in some instances a large geographical sphere, at least when it comes to the gods. So it's hard to generalize about them. Superstitious. Yeah, well, what is a superstition? The whole idea of a superstition is part and parcel of there being an organized religion, which has a clear ideology, and everything that's not possible to fit within that religion must be superstition. And I'm not sure that before Christianity there was that much organized religion. And what I mean to say is, of course, the pagan religions were organized to a degree, but were they ever as organized as the Christian religion? And of course, it took a long time for the Christian religion to become as organized as it eventually was, and they're still dealing with ambiguities in the 13th century. So it's not like, it takes a while for religion to answer all the questions that may arise.
And with Christianity, we forget that you have a canon set of texts that predates their organization in several different places. And in the West, we're most familiar with how, in a particular sect, it hitchhikes on the structure of the Roman Empire. And that introduces a lot of the sort of hierarchical, categorical, Greco-Roman thinking into it that I think isn't necessarily always there in the Old and New Testaments. So
there is a lot of mixing and merging and influencing, sometimes from below and sometimes from above. So, and with the pagan religions, sadly, we don't really have an undiluted example of it. because there was so much like there was such a strong relationship or interaction between the Christian religion and the pagan religion. So we have like 8 centuries of them living together. So it's not. So it's not like, it's hard to say this is completely influenced by Christianity about anything, any pagan source. So this is a problem that we have to deal with. This is of course why, because this is a short why almost all Old Norse mythology papers are trying to reconstruct something. We have this famous Old Norse mythology paper saying this is what the heathen religion was really like, and the answer is very often it was like Snorri, except we've scraped off the unoriginal bits, and then we can come to the true religion. And this is all very often all we can do. It's easy to mock it, but this is how we have to do things, because what else do we have? And of course we have other evidence, but it's slight and sometimes ambiguous. Like runes can also be ambiguous, pictures can be ambiguous, so it's never completely unambiguous. Yeah, I'm asked about death and revenge here, so that's an interesting question. And do the death hate the living? Very rarely. In most instances, they are just guarding their own possessions. They are unwilling to let go of their positions. They have been put in a mound, and they will not attack you unless you go into the mound to rob them. So the ghost that attacks humans for no good reason, that's not so common, actually. So we don't get them. But Thorur Bæjarfótur, of course, he is vengeful, I think. It's of course unclear why he does the thing he does, but it seems to be directed towards his,
Well, it seems like in Eya's saga that Eyjolf is afraid that Skallagrímur is going to be the same way.
Yeah.
Right? He has a suspicion Skallagrímur, it seems like it's going to be a vengeful Afturgangur, but it seemed to happen. I don't recall.
It's a very interesting depiction that Eyjolf treats the corpse of his late father as if it was a potential ghost. And there's Torvi Turnius has even mentioned the fact that perhaps Skallagrímur did influence Eyjolf's later life after his death, because the wind that kills his favorite son comes from the mount of Skallagrímur. So it's who knows what he did, but Eyjolf at least treats him like a potential ghost. But it's mostly evil people who become ghosts. So what is Eyjolf saying about his father? Well, he's saying, you are a troll, and I regard you as a troll.
His dad is a jerk, but so is Eyjolf.
He was not a model father, None of us would have liked to have him as a father. He was nasty, and he was both nasty and indifferent. It's
that whole saga is just I like to say that it's the story of the most horrible person in Icelandic literature in his wonderful life.
Yeah. But Eyjolf is in some ways admirable. Like, he has a lot of talent. He's a talented man.
True.
And he's completely misunderstood. The chapter about his childhood really changes the whole saga. If it wasn't there, it would be so easy to condemn him. But it is here, and in a way it's copied in Njalsa with the chapter about Hallgerður's youth.
Sure.
That completely must impact our whole interpretation of these people and make it possible for us to empathize with them. Because, nobody really would have wanted Eyjolf's childhood. And of course it's his own fault that he is despised. It's always your own fault to a degree that you're despised, but that doesn't make it any better or justify the people who despise you. It's just,
Eyjolf is a survivor.
He is. And he is clever, Like, one thing I noticed when I read the sagas, he doesn't really kill anyone in Iceland after his childhood. He kills all his people abroad.
It's true.
So he is intending to live peacefully in Iceland and will not kill a single person he cannot get away with. He kills his own slaves. He's allowed to do that. And else there's nothing.
He kind of threatens to kill the poet who brings in the shield.
Yes, he does.
Is that Einar Skallaglan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
But he
he's
doesn't
now
write it.
obligated. He's now obligated to make poetry about it, and he doesn't want to. You know, everyone who has had to write stuff understands this sentiment. You know,
Yes.
another article.
Yeah.
So
Hey, there you go.
or age.
Got a question from S. Faust about
Yes.
Galderlog.
Yes. Well, another ambiguous term. There's no Galter is connected to Gala, which means yell. So the etymology of the word suggests that it's a sound. And it's clear that people are chanting sometimes when they perform magic. So clearly one of the things that was, could make magic was chanting. So it's clearly something people could do. It's not in every instance seems to be there a necessity to chant, but it's clearly connected in Old Norse culture. Noise, yeah, it's hard to know if people thought it was beautiful or not. But of course, you can imagine it. You can, in a way, imagine everything in the sagas from a completely different standpoint that is taken. And this is something I did myself in my novel about Thorolfur Bægifótur. I wrote a novel about him. I think it's somewhere here. It's somewhere behind me over there.
What's it called?
Bookcase. It's called Glæsir. So it sees the whole narrative from his standpoint.
So it's named after him as a calf, a zombie calf.
Yeah, he's inside the calf, narrating the events, and they all seem completely different when you adopt his perspective. And of course, the reader may decide anyway that he's not a nice man, but he gets to explain things from his own view. And this is something that's possible with a lot of things in the sagas. There is a point of view, and of course, people have done it. Poets and writers, like there are a lot of people who do not believe Hallkell Langbrók was evil. They say you can see the whole thing from her point of view, and this is something the saga allow us to do in a way. The saga has its own view, but it's always possible to, like in the Laxdæla saga, would you have wanted to be Bolli, who was always second best, and must have had all these silver medals in his home. He was second in every contest. So it's easy to see things from his view if you just adopt it for a while, But the saga doesn't necessarily do it. But there is this imminent possibility of regarding things as completely different. So, and people are influenced by that today. People tend to read against what the sagas are trying to feed them. But in a way, I think they sometimes allow for that, or they're just one variation of a tale.
I think it's well put.
Yeah.
I have one question that's down here on the bottom of the screen in the question and answer section. Kona asks, why snake pits in Norse mythology? Should we understand it literally or figuratively as something evil, deadly, or sneaky? I wonder because there are very few venomous snakes to be found in the region, unlike in the Mediterranean.
Well, there are only 2 snake pits, as far as I can remember. And they're both in the myths. They're in Ragnar's. There's Ragnar Loðbrók and it's Gunnar Jakobsson. And these narratives may hail from a very distant past and location, But what are the snakes? It's hard, this is another ambiguity because, we have the Old Norse dragon, and Tolkien said there were only 2 dragons in Old Norse myth, but he didn't count all of them. He didn't count the insignificant ones. And those he counted are not called dragon, like Dreki. The word Dreki is not used about precisely the 2 dragons that Tolkien wanted to include, but it's used about other beings. And how big are they? I've seen all sizes of dragons in modern, films and TV, and sometimes the dragon seems, smaller and larger even, So obviously Fafnir was quite big, and the dragon that Ragnar killed was quite big, but we don't really know how big they are or why people imagine these dragons, An obvious solution is that some dinosaur bones were found in the Middle Ages, and how would people interpret them if they found them? Well, obviously as a dragon. So that's one possibility, but also like it's a fantasy creature, and you don't always know where it comes from. But it's of course we don't have snakes in Iceland. I think the deadliest animal here is the fox or something like that. It's not a country full of deadly animals. The wasp was treated with much seriousness when it arrived a couple of decades ago. So,
do you think a dragon is a troll? Would you put that in that term?
I would hesitate to do it because the troll always seems more human.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And it's never specifically used in a dragon tale. That being said, though, dragons are also human. Like Fafnir talks, and he is originally a human, so he's not completely inhuman. But it's used. But the word seems to imply a humanoid creature.
Okay.
And I think some trolls are just regular humans believed to have witch powers, and you can see it in the law codes. Like, it's forbidden to have supper with a troll. And why is this forbidden? Because the troll must be a witch or possibly a heretic. Because if you don't want to believe in witches either, there would have been possible heretics, people who are been excommunicated, and they might be interpreted as trolls. So the troll, and in the law codes also forbidding the waking up of trolls. So you cannot wake up a troll, and you cannot wake up a troll, and you cannot have supper with it after you wake. But I think it's like a Frankenstein situation, like in the 20th century, not in the original novel, of course, where Frankenstein is the scientist. But in the 20th century sort of popular parlance, you use it both for the scientist and the monster. And we use it all the zombie, because the Frankenstein monster is a zombie, isn't he? He's a dead person who is reanimated. And this is the same way with the troll in the Middle Ages. Like, there is a witch, and there is a ghost, and the ghost has been awakened, and who has done this? It must be the witch. So both are trolls. Both the creature and the creator are trolls. So
it makes
I like the Frankenstein mix-up because it reminds me of the Middle Ages, even though it's very
excellent example.
Yeah.
It makes it really hard to translate a word like troll, right? Because it seems like you can have 20 different words that translate it. There's no, I guess the closest you could get to a one-word translation might be something like monster, but even that's not quite right, because we don't think of witches as monsters usually today.
Yeah, I wouldn't really translate it, because it's like we have the internet troll, and the internet troll is a very strange, nobody knows, nobody has seen them. It's just some people you meet on the internet, and they attack you, and for no reason, or for their own strange logic. So I think it's an accident that this is the same word. Yeah. But I think it's an happy accident. So it's so I think it's in a way meaningful that the internet trolls are here today to attack you.
In the same, and we don't see them. We don't have a clear idea of what they look like. You have a different image than I have, probably, of a troll.
Yeah. I'm sure. I think there was somebody who phoned his trolls, who phoned the people who abused them and talked to them, and they were all much nicer and regular people than he had thought. Because sometimes a troll is not. It's just that, they are. Dylan Maron is and so he in a way is dealing with the trolls in his own way.
As long as he didn't have supper with him.
Yeah. but they have some kind of humanity, a conversation with people who hate me. So but it is a fascinating enterprise from a troll perspective, because the troll, but it also reminds us that the trolls must be hidden to remain trolls. It's hard to draw them into the light, and they don't really seem that bad, when the light is.
Kind of point. In a sense, the whole part of the whole identity is the hiddenness, the occult.
Yeah.
To use the original meaning of that word, nature of the
Yeah.
Now, with some of the last little bit of time left, I wanted to ask what you think about the elf. I have often kind of thought, you touched on this a little bit earlier, as sort of the benign answer to the troll.
Yeah.
Do you think that the elf is related to the dwarf? Because we do see Snorri using Svartalvar and Dvergar about Ph.D.'s sons.
Yeah, there's a terrible mix-up about elves and dwarfs. There's also elves that are evil. There are in the Fornaldarsögur elves who are not good. They are like, and I think the word spirit is also used. So I think it's possible to see the elves as evil too, especially after Christianity. I think they're probably a remnant from the pagan age, and people made sacrifices to them, and it's possible to regard them as evil after Christianity. And they're not, but it's like they're not really talked much about. Like, there are a lot of dwarfs, there's a lot of talk about dwarfs, but there's not that much about elves in the Icelandic Middle Ages. They do reappear very strongly in the post-medieval age, having conflated with the Huldufolk.
Right.
And they are both benign and hostile. Like, they are a superior race, but you shouldn't mix up with them. It's dangerous for humans to mix up with them.
Well, I think in Saga, where he sleeps with an Alfkona.
Yeah, and he gets his comeuppance. Of course, she does ask him not to sleep with her, and he does anyway.
That's true.
So this is not a nice thing he does. So in a way, he just gets his just desserts, and this is something that people get. It's often imagined that paranormal beings bring some kind of justice, and this is something like Stephen King feeds on this notion. Like, people do something wrong, and the paranormal comes for them, and you empathize with them, but they're still guilty.
That's an interesting point, because Helgi, who sleeps with the Alfkona, he did rape another woman before that. In a sense, this is coming back on him that way.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that. That's an excellent point.
Yeah. He gets his just desserts. He is. I'm asked about disability here, and this is interesting. I'm involved with disability at the moment. I'm a part of a project at the University of Iceland about disability, and this is another very problematic taxonomical issue, because is there really medieval disability? There are people who cannot see and cannot hear, but is there a notion of the disabled in the Middle Ages? And this is what we're trying to find out. Like, how much do people equate things that today would be seen as disabilities? But I don't see any. Yeah, thank you. And I don't see any particular tendency to refer to people with disabilities as trolls, unless you postulate that Grettir had a disability or Skarphéðinn. It's not really my cup of tea, like trying to medically diagnose saga heroes. People do it a bit, and people have been doing it in Iceland, and I think they seem more normal to me than they sometimes seem in this type of analysis. Like, there's Skarphéðinn is completely logical if you interpret him in that way. Grettir, of course, is he is big. He's a big person, but he's not necessarily like disabled. I don't know. It's just, and of course, it's hard to say. And I think the notion of disability needs to be examined much more. Like, also there's the very close connection between superhuman powers and disability with the gods, like with Odin and Tyr and all these gods that lack a body part. So, and in a way, Odin loses his eye to gain sight, so he has more sight than the rest of us. But we're just beginning in this project, and so it's it's a new thing for us. But I would warn against any facile attempt to just take modern disabilities and just move them to the Middle Ages and begin by expecting everything to be the same. So it is different. But again, there may have been many disabilities that were never mentioned. So they were not really seen as disabilities. Old age certainly is seen as kind of impairing. So we have that, and It composes poetry about how bad it is to be old when he's like driven out of his own kitchen. He goes full circle. He's despised as a kid, and then he's very potent, and then did he? Okay, it's an interesting thing about Linné. Linné is my nemesis in a way. I much admire him, but I think his system of classification has been kind of overwhelming for folklore. People tend to take it and sort of classify things we see as if they're animals. You can just classify them. So
Even with
like
animals, it can be hard. You have certain hybrids that can be actually vital enough to reproduce, and what species is that? I mean, how do you categorize some of those?
Yeah, it's hard in science, but it's even tougher with folklore. Like, these are things we see. So how are they really different, or are they just here? So and how can we take a linear system to categorize things we see? So is it an elf or a troll, or who knows? So it's.
I think that's a great place to maybe wind down here with that last point you just made. That's really excellent. Do you have time to take another question if there is one?
Yeah. Well, I can say about this that I'm getting more and more interested in 19th century scholarship and 20th century scholarship. I just can't get away from it. We are so it has provided such a strong framework for us. We're always working within. We always begin in this frame that was built by somebody else, and this framework has a lot of premises that people don't believe in anymore, but we still work from it. And this is so. I am looking more and more at the scholars instead of looking at the texts, and I think it's hard to separate sometimes the scholars from the text, because they have written themselves into the texts.
Well, Guðbrandur Vigfússon is someone who comes to mind. I mean, he didn't do anything, he didn't modify extremely. He also seems like a really kind of cool guy. He looks like Scott Weiland. He looks like he'd be the front man, like a 90s band.
Well, of course, everyone was more cool in the 19th century.
It's true.
But the scholars in particular, they were extremely cool.
Oh, I bet he could beat me up. Well, thank you, Ármann, very much for being here today and for answering our questions, and for your excellent points, especially about these taxonomic problems around terms like troll.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it all, and it was useful in some way. And of course, I see Stella has posted a lot of links, so there's enough to read. There's a lot of homework if you want to.
Well, thank you. And to Ármann and everybody else, wish you all the best.
And thanks for waking up this early.
Oh, I'm not.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'll bring it to an end then. Ármann, thank you again, and all the best.
Okay. Nice to talk to you.